Welcome to this new Blender tutorial, new to me, or new from me. So when I first started Blender and I wanted to render something, I was a bit mystified. I didn't know what was going on. So I wanted to create a video which just takes you through a few steps to go from having your lovely model with some texture on it. I've just used some procedurals here through to having a nice rendered image. And I've got a speaker, it's pretty much set up. We've got a few bits and bobs on it that I'll change. I've changed some materials and updated this and that. And we'll go from essentially having a single model in the scene with no real lights or cameras and so on and so forth, and we will end up with this, which I hope you think looks worthwhile. So let's get on with it. Let me stop the waffling and I will start in the next section. Good morning and welcome to this next Blender video. In this video I have a modest little speaker I've modelled here and I want to show it off. So we're going to go through a few things to set up a little scene, set some lighting in the camera and get a nice render out of it. Okay, so first of all I want to add in a little bit of a background prop for this, like a ground plane and a back plane. So let's do that first. So I'm in object mode and I'm going to add a plane to the scene, and then on that plane we'll go to edit mode, tab, and then I'll select this rear edge, and then we'll use control and not control, sorry, I'll just use extrude and I'll bring that up. So now we've got ground and the back, so our speaker isn't floating in space. But there's one issue. Now it might be a matter of choice. If you want it to be a harsh horizon line, then leave it as it is. If you don't, then this is an option for you. So if I click on this line here and press Ctrl B to bevel, then I can pull it out to bevel it, and I can make it as tight or as long as I want. And when I'm happy, just hit click, and then we could adjust the number of segments to make it smoother or not. You can experiment with that. You might want something that transitions sort of like in 3 spaces, so you might only have one. You might want something a bit rougher, but I want it nice and smooth. Okay, so that's got us a nice little piece to work with, and I'm just going to come into my speaker and get roughly where I want my render to be from. So it's somewhere around there. I'm just trying to get an estimate of how much space I'm not covering with my backdrop. So let's come out here, and in edge mode I'm going to box select this edge, and then we'll press G to move it, and let's move it right out of the way. And then when I go back in, I should have an idea of whether it's going to fill it or not. And it's not. I'm going to have to go right over there. Okay, let's move it. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm not going to put any kind of texture or anything on it. It's just I want it to fill the space, and it looks like I might need to take the top up as well. So let's grab the top and move that right up. Probably not going to need much here, but hey, why not while we're here. Okay, so that's got us a backdrop, and we can move it around, we can do a few things, but our speaker is now in some sort of space. It's not floating around in the ether. That's good. We've got something to put shadows on, and all good stuff. So next thing I want to do is try and get my camera angle in. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we need a starting point. So we'll do that in the next video. So the camera then, this completely bemused me for quite a long time about arranging the camera in Blender, because I thought, well, why can't I just render this one, the one that I'm looking at? Well, it just didn't work that way essentially. So let's go back to object mode with tab, and I'm going to select on my speaker here and start to kind of arrange it as I want it. So, you know, I can move it around. So perhaps have it to, you know, to one side of the, you know, my hopeful render, and yeah, just get it to kind of where you want it. I mean, do you want to be looking up at it? Do you want to be looking down at it? You know, do you want to be looking straight on at it, which would be kind of dull in this case? So I'm going to be looking up at it, I think. I want kind of a sense of size and shape. And when you've got it about where you want it, and I think somewhere around there, whoops, I keep moving it, stop it, John. Yeah, somewhere about there, you can press Control Alt and then 0 on your number pad, and then it will do that. What we've done is switch to our camera view, to our render camera view, and it's showing you what we're going to see. So we have a button here which kind of switches between the two, but what the Control Alt 0 does is matches your current view to your render view, or your render view to your current view, if that makes sense. So that little tip just, you know, changed everything for me. Now I understood it. You know, it's actually straightforward. I don't have to move it, you know, around a lot to, you know, make it work. Saying that, it's not showing what the camera view is showing, and that's because the camera settings between the two are different. So what we need to do is select our camera and then start to manipulate the camera settings to get it somewhere about right. So first of all, we'll select our camera settings in the properties, this little green camera here, and we have a few things to look at. So we've got our sensor type, so we can change that around to do all sorts of things, and I'm going to stick on auto for the minute. We've got our focal lengths and sizes and shifts and our clip starts and ends. So I'm going to keep it relatively simple and stick that to 35mm because, you know, 35mm camera. I'm led to believe that, you know, 40 to 45 is, you know, somewhere about right, but, you know, you set it to what you want. And of course, the lower your focal length, you know, the more exaggerated the perspective is going to be. You see that I've gone to 10 and it's gone nuts, and you know, maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want this really exaggerated kind of perspective. If you go higher, say to 180, then it's really going to flatten it down and, you know, take away that kind of perspective look. So let's go 35, and now I'm nearly there. It's nearly framed, but it's not quite framed yet. So what can we do? Well, if you go to the transform settings here, you know, the main properties, we can still manipulate these here to move things around. So I'm thinking that my how can I put it, upward angle is perhaps a little bit too much. So let's adjust it. So I can adjust my X angle. I'm just left clicking and dragging in that box. We can move the camera. Bear in mind, I'm moving the camera, I'm not moving the prop. And, you know, we can do what we need to do to get the framed picture that you want. And bear in mind that, you know, I'm starting with one speaker, I'm going to end up with two, and I'm leaving enough space to get the second speaker in. Okay, so what else have we got? On the render settings, am I on the right one? No. I'm on cycles, and on my output I've got 1920 by 1080 at the moment. So I'm going to keep that aspect ratio, but for my final render I may make that much bigger. But for preview purposes I don't need any more than that. In fact, I could probably go down if I really wanted to. Anyway, so that's framing up our image, but now we need to start to have a look at our lighting. If I switch over to the rendered view, we can see what we've got. We've got our white background, we've got our speaker, there's a nice shadow in there, we've got some things, you know, some spec highlights coming off those rounds on the front of the speaker, and it's okay, but it's only one light, and we need to kind of adjust that to show off our model to its best possible, you know, well. Okay, so next thing then, I'm going to start to arrange my lights. I'm going to add some lights, move them around to get a nice lighting scheme for my speaker. So I will talk to you in the next video. Okay, so let's select our light here and see what we can do with it, you know, where it is. So if we go to the little light bulb down here, the little green light bulb, the light properties, we have a few options we can do. So my scene is quite dark at the moment, and I'm about to make it even darker because I only want light in this scene that's coming from the lights I tell it, you know. And by default, let me just turn this off. If I go to the world properties, you'll notice the surface, under surface, I have a strength of 1. And if I turn that off, everything gets a bit darker because, you know, by default Blender is giving it kind of an ambient light of 1. So let's go back to our properties then. So if I want to brighten this up, I have two choices. I can move it closer, or I can increase the wattage. So if I do increase the watts, I get a lighter scene. Things are coming a bit more bright now. You'll see on that that bottom metal kind of ring there on the speaker cone, we're getting a bit more bounce from the ground plane, which is nice. It's good. And we could go even higher than that, say 4,000. There we go, and it gets even brighter. And it's perhaps a bit too bright now, you know, but these things are there, and we need to be able to adjust them. So another thing here is, let me put this down to 2,000. We can control how hard our shadows are from here. So you notice I've got some quite hard shadows here. There is a bit of kind of fuzz and bits around it, but especially where this kind of middle piece of the speaker is in shade, we've got this little kind of hard shadow. So we control that by the radius, and this is the size of the light. And essentially, the bigger the light, the more diffuse and soft the shadows will be. So if I set that to 1, for example, I hope you can then see as this resolves that shadow is now really soft. In fact, for a lot of it, it's kind of hard to see it's there at all because the transition is so soft. If I put it down to 0.5, it's becoming a little bit more defined, and then at 0.1, which is our kind of default, we've got a hard shadow again. So you can adjust that up and down to, you know, to your requirements, or we can tell it to not cast shadows at all. Other than that, we have our light color, and of course we can go warmer, pick out, you know, a reddish, so orangey, yellowy warm color, or we can go cooler, and that's largely dependent upon what you're looking for. I'm going to stay fairly neutral and pop it in the middle for white. There we go. Okay, so that's one light, and you know what I'm looking for here is that, you know, the light is helping with my scene, that the shadows are helping to define my object, that, you know, they're showing that they have shape, and, you know, they're indented or they're outdented, and that, you know, this isn't just a drawing, you know, a 2D drawing that somebody has done and is really, really flat. Well, very talented artists will make it very good, of course, but for me personally, it'd look flat, I promise you. So now we're down to the positioning of the light, and I can see that this light is casting kind of horizontally across here for my shadow, and you know, maybe that's not the right thing. So now I'm just going to switch out of that to give my PC a rest, and then go to the layout tab. If I zoom out, I can see that my light is actually really kind of horizontal onto that, so I could move it backwards, we could move it sort of inwards a little bit. If I move it closer, it's going to increase the amount of light, and we can always check that by just popping into the view, the camera view on this little button here, or numpad 0, and then turning it on. And I can see my shadows moving a little bit. I'm losing quite a lot of the shadow that I had across my cone here, but not too much of it. I think perhaps enough to make it annoying. So I'm going to switch back to my normal view, if Blender will give me my mouse back, and if I take that upwards, I should get some of that back, because obviously the higher, you know, the light is casting from, you know, the more exaggerated that's going to be. Okay, let's pop back into our view and turn that on. Like I say, it's starting to creep there, and we are getting some sort of shadow going, which is good. Okay, so first of all, we've got our first light in, but we want to, you know, add some additional lights to give some additional detail. So in the next section, we'll have a look at adding a second light in, and maybe a third, to pick out some details and some curvature and some specular from our model. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, for our second source of light, I'm going to add in another point. So let's just come out of that camera view there, and this is what our scene looks like. It's very exciting, and in object mode, whoops, I'm going to come out of this to give my PC a rest. We'll go to add and light and point, and that will create us a little point light right in the center of things. So I'm going to move that off to the side and to behind our object, and let's bring it up a bit. Now, to make this really, really visible, I'm going to give this a mad color, and that's going to help me pick out what light's coming from this light rather than the other light. So let's go back to our render view and turn our render on, and I can see then that actually it's not hitting the front as you'd expect, but it is hitting the side, and we're getting this reddish tinge, and it's only set to 10 watts at the minute, so let's be mad, put it up to 500 and really see what's going on, and you can see, you know, how far it's reaching and how, you know, it's affecting our scene. So it's lighting pretty much this whole side, and I want to make it a little bit more interesting than that. So I think I might raise it up in hopes that, where's my mouse, there it is, that I can get it to sort of cast on like a diagonal corner here. So easiest thing for me personally is to come out and just raise that up a bit, and then pop back in. Whoops, that's the wrong button. There we go. I can see it's starting a little higher before I'm getting the really strong kind of wash here. So yes, I think that's okay. So let's take this down to a level where I'm happy with it. So now it's casting less on the back or on the rear of it, and you know, we're getting more concentrated at the top. Let's take it down to 100, and yes, now it's pretty much only this front top corner, a little kind of diagonal slice there. So I don't want it to be red, so I'm going to pop that back to white, maybe somewhere towards bluish, nothing too overt. There we go, and now we've got this nice line down here adding some extra, and we've got this nice kind of wash going across that top corner. And if you wonder if it's making a difference or not, turn it off, and yes, it's definitely making a difference. So that's that bit. So I've got a couple of lights and I'm quite happy with the way they're behaving. This one I might actually make a little bit bigger because I want to soften that shadow, but not too much. Let's put it to 0.2 instead. Is that enough? No, it's not. Let's use the law of doubles. That's a bit nicer. Just trying to get less of a harsh shadow line across the the edge of the shadow where it's transitioning to no shadow. Okay, so I've got some nice highlights going on up here. I've got a nice line going across that top, which is good. I've got this coming down here. That's nice. It's kind of defining a little bit more of the shape and such like, giving it a little bit more of an extra dimension. But next I want to start thinking about my materials, because I've kind of thrown some materials on this to give me a starting point, and I'm not going to change the colours too much, but I am going to change a couple of the properties to make them a little bit better. So in the next one we're going to update those, and we're going to get it so we're happy before we duplicate this speaker to be our next next object in the scene. Okay, so I will talk to you then. Okay, so I've got my kind of light in and I'm happy with that, but I'm not entirely happy with how some of the materials react to it. So let me just go to the shading room, and I've got my speaker, this kind of speaker face material selected, which is just basically a noise added up and multiplied together and turned into a base color and a bump. So it's basically bumping where it's coloring. They're identical, just changed. So I'm not getting much reflection off of it, and that's a little bit of an issue, because a lot of speakers have some sort of shininess to them. Some are very shiny, some are very, very matte, and there are a fair few somewhere in the middle, and I want somewhere in the middle. So for this one I'm going to just turn my roughness down. So if I take my roughness down, it's going to become a bit shinier. However, I've made an issue, or made a mistake on my bump, because my bump is just gonna grab the light and bounce it off in all different directions, so I'm going to get a very fuzzy reflection, which isn't always bad, but I don't want a really, really fuzzy reflection. So let me turn that back on again, and yeah, you'll see that I am getting a bit more light reflected off this. However, the bump is scattering it around a lot, and it's scattering around too much. I mean, it looks like sandpaper at the minute. So it's just a case of then, in my little bump channel here, which is taking this mix in from these two Voronoi, is it? I don't know how you say it, nodes, and I'm going to take that strength down. So I'm going to take it down in increments and let it resolve. Now you'll see one issue that has already kind of happened here is I'm kind of losing my shadow, which I was quite pleased with. However, I think I've managed to lose that completely. If I turn this up again, back to 0.5, let me see if I can point it out. See, I've got a nice kind of shadow ring going, or transition going around here. Come on PC, let go. There we go, around here, and that is being supported by the bump, because if I take this down to say 0.3, I'm not getting it at all anymore. It's gone, and that's something I'll either have to accept or I'll have to adjust something else. In this case, I'm going to accept it, because even though I've updated it and it looks better, I'm getting some shine off it, I'm not getting enough shine off it. So I'm going to take its strength down all the way to 0.1, and I'm getting far more of a concentrated specular there. I could take it down even further, or I could reduce the roughness even further. So if I take that down to 0.1, for example, we should get an even stronger thing there. But I quite like the ring effect, so let's pop that back to 0.2. So another, control we have on this is the specular. So my specular is at 0.5. If I turn that all the way up, I should get a whole wash of light coming in. See, I'm getting, a much broader kind of white now. If I turn this down to 0.5 and let it resolve, you see it's much darker. So we've got specular to deal with as well, or to work with as well. And if I turn down at 0, I get none at all. So just be aware that it's not just roughness, we've got some speck in here as well. So it was at 0.5, so let's try 0.75. And then, because I'm in close up here and I'm quite happy with how it looks here, not necessarily actually how it looks in the real, in our final render. So let's go back to our layout room where I've got that. And there we are. So I'm really happy with how this top one is reacting to it. I've got some real nice, spec points on there. That's working really well. I've got quite the surround is quite dark, but that surround is flat, so it's not really picking up any reflections or emissions from the ground plane. Saying that, this bottom one is conical, and therefore it is getting stuff from the ground plane, and that's why we've got this kind of lighter area across the top where it's picking up the reflection from the ground plane. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. The last thing I'm really quite unhappy with is the metal surround. It's all a bit plain and boring. At the moment, it's a colour, and it's metallicity is turned up and roughness is turned down a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look to add some noise to it to give it some interest. So we'll do that in the next one. Okay, so I want to look at my metal then and give it some surface kind of interest or variation, just at some at least. So I've come to the shading room and I've just picked my metal, and as you can see I've got a very plain kind of shader here that isn't doing very much. We've got a colour, we've got metallic jacked up to 1 and roughness down to 0.33, but I want to give it some kind of variation. So what we're going to use for that is a noise node and perhaps a waves node. We'll see as I get there. So first of all, press Shift A, and then under texture we'll select the noise texture, and if I drop that in here, we have two outputs from this. This is essentially the black and white output, and this is the color output. If I pop the color output into the color, you'll see I get this kind of variation across the whole, and if I pop the black and white in, we get the variation, but it's grayscale, which is essentially what we're going to want. So I'm going to leave it at that one for the moment. We have some options on here in terms of scales and details and such like, but before I go into those, I'm just going to add in a couple of nodes to help us. So first of all, I have, if you go to Edit Preferences and type in Node under Add-ons, I've got the Node Wrangler enabled, and that just helps speed things up. So enable that on your machines then, and then select the node and press Ctrl and T, and that adds me a mapping node and a texture coordinates node. So this hasn't changed significantly since I added these, but if I plug these in to different slots, we'll see that we get different results, some tighter than others, some more diffuse, and so on. And that might become far more apparent when I increase the scale of this to actually get some sort of perceptible detail. So currently I'm on the UV, which is basically taking my UV coordinates and helping project this texture. If I switch that to generated, you'll see it becomes far tighter, far smaller, more detailed. And if I switch it to object, you'll see it's kind of blowing out a bit. It's just the different ways that the shader system has to take your image map or texture map and projecting it onto your model. So for an image, if you've painted your model and it's on a 2D image, you're going to want it to be UV. Okay, so on top of that, we have, I'm going to switch this back to UV, some transform options. So we've got a few options here in terms of what the type of thing it is, and I'm going to leave it on point, but what we do have is the ability to transform it in space. So we can transform the X, Y and Z, we can rotate it a bit, and we can even scale it, and I'm going to scale it out, try a couple of different directions, whoops, don't mean 0, to get a more streaked kind of texture. Okay, so with that done, we have a black and white mask or a grayscale piece that we can plug into our roughness to get different values out. So if I plug that in there and unplug that from there, we should see the difference. So now I've got some quite shiny bits, and I've got some very, very dull bits, and that's because my range is off. I've got a very black and white range, and what we want is somewhere much closer together. And what we can do from that is add in a color ramp. So if I press Shift A again, this time under converter, I want to pick color ramp, and I'll just click between those two and it will add it in. So you'll see it's not changed for a moment because our color ramp is between black and white. We want to bring those colors a bit closer together to get the effect we want. So if I turn the black right up, you'll see it goes very, very shiny. So black is essentially shiny. So what I'm going to do is pick a darker grey, but not completely dark, to represent a shiny but not completely shiny texture. And if I turn that up, oops, we're still getting that going, which is not what I want. So at the other side, I'm going to change this range as well, and I'm going to bring this down to perhaps a grey somewhere around there, which is almost the maximum that I want in this particular instance. So if I squeeze those together, they're going to become shinier, but what I actually want to do is just come out and have a look at it and see how we're looking. So it's getting quite a lot of colour from outside now, and I just want to adjust these so that I get less. So this I think is too much. I need to come down a little bit, and this is also too much but in the other direction, so I want to come up a bit. There we go, somewhere along those lines I think. If I take that down, it should become duller. If I take those up, they'll become shinier, but I don't want them to be shinier. There we go, just trying to get a very subtle kind of variation off them. So with that done, I just wanted to show you one little trick here. So I've got a lovely black and white map here, and I could use it if I wanted to actually put some surface bump on this. So for that, I'll press Shift A, and under the vector options, where's the vector option gone? There it is. There's a bump, and if I pop that in there and take my input from the noise texture into height, it's going to convert this into a normal map. And if I plug that into the normal on the shader, you'll see it bumps immediately. I don't want it to, not that much anyway. So what I can do is take my strength down until it's at a kind of stage where it's really, really subtle but not invisible. Whoops, I've dragged the wrong thing. There we go. So you can actually type in here, so I'm going to go for perhaps 0.1. That's too much. What I want is 0.01. So now I've got some variation on my bump as well as my roughness to, you know, get out what we want, or something closer to it at least. So if I pop to my layout room now and turn my render back on, we should get some sort of difference. And you know, this is going to tell me whether I've been, you know, too heavy-handed or not. I can see I've got a lot of kind of you know, variation going on down here. It looks quite dirty, so I might have been a bit over the top, but I think I'm going to live with it. Yeah. Again, personal taste, down to what you want, what you don't want. You know, I could go in and reduce the bump a little bit on this, and I think that would perhaps come right. Or change my colour range to, you know, alter the variation. But I'm liking the way it's breaking things up. Okay, so we've adjusted our materials, we've got our lights, we've got our camera angle. Next, I just need to duplicate this model and move it off to one side to give me an extra speaker in my scene. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, so I just want to duplicate this speaker now, and I didn't want to do that before I'd made any texture adjustments, because I would just have to do it again essentially, which makes no sense. Either delete it and, you know, replace it, or duplicate the texture changes. So what I want to do first is add a subsurface modifier to this subsurface. So I'm going to make sure I've got my cube selected, and then add a modifier subsurface or subdivision surface. There we go. So that's smoothed out that kind of jaggedness I had around that front speaker hole. And just to make sure, I'm going to add one extra one in there to let that really, you know, really belt and braces. Okay, so to duplicate it, I have to have it selected, and I can press Shift D, and now I can move it around. If I want to restrict the movement here, I could perhaps use Z, and then I could only move it up and down, or I could press X and only move it left and right, or I could press Y, only move it front to back. or I can exclude an axis by pressing Shift and the axis. So if I want to move it along the ground plane, I want to exclude Z, so Shift Z, and now I can move it around. It's a little bit awkward and it's getting a bit sticky in places. I think that's my PC more than anything. So I'm going to pop it around about there. Okay, it's also just kind of facing in the same direction, which is a bit dull, so to make it a little bit more interesting, I'm going to press the R key and I'm going to rotate it. So I could rotate it full on that way, or I could go the other way. You know, it's a composition choice, and I'm going to rotate it that way. And then I think I might move it back a bit, so G, and then move it backwards. So now I've got kind of a line, you know, a diagonal line heading that way and then that way, and that's yeah, I'm quite happy with that. Okay, so other than that, we've got our speakers in there, we've got both of them. We might change that arrangement at some point in time. We could change our backplane a little bit. So if I select the backplane and go down to materials and add a new one, we should be able to change these values and see what happens. So I could change colour. So I could sort of go for a warmish colour depending upon what you're looking for, or I could go for a cool colour. I would just advise not going, you know, really cool, really saturated, I mean. So I'm just going kind of a subtle, heading for a subtleish bluish colour. Yeah, and that should be good. Let's have a look. So let's turn on the preview render, and yeah, not bad, I think. They definitely look like speakers. Maybe they're not the best in the world. Maybe I could have chosen a different colour scheme, and I'm not entirely sure I like the blue tinge, so I'm going to perhaps untinge that a bit. I still want it a bit bluish, but not quite as yeah, not quite as blue as it was. Or saturated, that's the word, keep forgetting it. Okay, so I'm essentially ready. I could do a few other bits and bobs, I could fill more things in the scene, but I just want to look at my speakers, you know, which I spent, you know, quite a bit of time putting together, in theory. So what we're going to do next is just have a look at a few options on the render itself, and how we can utilise those to get a bit extra out. So I shall talk to you then. Okay, so we're going to set up a couple of settings on there before we set off our render, because I want to add a couple of render passes. So let's have a look at the passes piece, passes properties window here. So under data, we have a denoising data. This is some sort of weird magic which helps us to denoise our image without having to denoise it during the render. So it calculates it, it saves some additional data, and then we can combine that in the compositing area to take our noise out. And similarly, I also want to do that for our ambient occlusion. So I'm going to turn ambient occlusion on down here, so we'll get a second render pass for our ambient occlusion. All we need to do now is set our settings for it, and that's in this little world properties area here. So I can turn on ambient occlusion here, but I don't want to, because it's going to try and do it on the fly, and I don't want it to. I want to do it during the render. Plus it also adds some extra lighting that I don't want. I just want to darken up the shadows. So I'm going to turn that. Whoops! No, I'm not going to turn it on. What I do want to do is set the distance though. So the distance by default is some sort of insane 10 meters, which seems an awful long way. especially since my lovingly modelled speakers here are to scale and they're about 12 inches high. So I only want a low value in here, and I'm going to go for about 4 inches just to give myself a slightly overblown version. Okay, so with those set, we can go and have a look at our actual render settings. So I've got it at 1920 by 1080 for kind of a preview size, and that's what I'm going to do in this particular tutorial. And if I have a look under my not the layer properties, what am I talking about? My render, where is it? Here it is. I've got it set cycles. I'm going to put my GPU to work, and I'm going to increase my render samples up to about 200 just to see, just to get a bit more quality. Okay, so now that I've done that, I can actually press the render button. Now you don't want to watch it render. I'm pretty sure you don't, but I'll start it off and then I'll let it finish between videos. So it's up on my render area here, or I could go to the rendering room and click the same button and render, and it's now going to go off and start to do the job. Okay, so I'll stop the video here and I'll come back in the next section. Okay, so we've rendered our render and it looks good. If I zoom in a bit, we'll see we've got quite a bit of noise and such like, and we obviously have our AO pass that we rendered out. So how do I use all those, or how do you use all of those? Whoever. Well, if you go to the compositing room, you'll see, if you've never used it before, it's blank. And this confused me for quite a long time until I press this button up here for use nodes, and then everything magically appears. So I'm just going to separate these out a little bit to give myself some space, and the first thing I'm going to do is visualize our piece. So if I press Shift A and just type in viewer up here, I believe there is a shortcut code for it somewhere, it will add a viewer to my workspace, and I can take any of our images or outputs from the render layers to visualize what they look like. And the ones we're really interested in is the noise image, the denoised image, the denoised albedo, and the AO. So this is what the AO looks like. It's black and white map, and where it's black, objects are coming together. It's occluding light from there. If we look at our noisy image, we have our noisy image and a denoised image. Sorry, denoised normal, which it's basically a normal map essentially, but it's used in the process of denoising. And we have a denoising albedo. Okay, so how do we use those? It's all very well seeing them, but we want to actually put them all together. So for the denoising, we need a denoising filter. I'm just going to leave that over there. So Shift A, down to filters and denoise, and I'll pop that there, and I'll put the image into the output there, and now I'm going to add all these in. So noisy image first, and then normal, and then our albedo. I can disconnect this because it's not doing anything anymore, and that has given me a lovely smooth image down there at the back. If I just take the noisy image and plug it into the output, you'll see now it's kind of noisy and grainy, but if I plug our denoised image into it, you should see it smooths up quite nicely. Okay, so I do still have some bump and sort of reflection off my speaker on my metal outlays there, so that's good. I'm not losing all that. I'm just losing a lot of noise in the dark essentially. So our AO. so what we need for the AO is to basically do like a Photoshop layer blend with our outputs, and for that we need a mix node. So Shift A, I believe this one is under color and mix, and then we have two inputs, a mode and some other options. So what I want to do is pop my AO into the bottom, and let's pop this into the output, see what's happening. So now the AO is in the bottom and that's what it's showing me, and I'll put my noisy image in the top, and now that's what it's showing me, which is of no use whatsoever. And now I need to blend them. So if I switch the blend to multiply, oops, I have put my noisy image into entirely the wrong place. There we go. Let me disconnect that one. So now I've got them combined together. If I just take my noisy image over, actually if I just take my denoise over, you'll see that that becomes light at the corner. So that's our raw kind of output which has been denoised. And if I now take my image over here and pop it over there, this is the ambient occlusion pass being applied, but no denoising. So all I actually need to do is take that out of there and plug it into there and that to there. So I've just basically bypassed the noisy image through the multiply node, through the denoise into our render. So that looks pretty good. I'm quite pleased with that. Even my little LED down the bottom looks about right. Doesn't look, just like a flat bit of light. It's got something to it. So now I can't just go back to the rendering room and see my nice new shiny image, because that's the render result. What I want is the result from that viewer node. So I'm going to come down there and change my output to the viewer node, and now I've got my lovely final image that I can save and use to showcase some talent, possibly some talent. I'm not the most talented at rendering or anything like that. I'm far more of a modeler than I am a renderer. I'm not very visual in terms of what looks nice on paper. Anyway, it's enough of that stuff. But yes, I hope you found that useful. So I hope you can now take your your lovely modelled piece and pop it into a nice little scene and render it like this. Okay, that's that. So again, thank you for watching, especially if you've watched to the end, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to talk to you in another video.